This narrow strip of water is the Dardanelles, lying at the northern end of the Aegean Sea. It separates mainland Europe from Asia. Over the centuries, many desperate battles have been fought here. In 1915, the forces of Britain, France, and their empires clashed with the Turkish army at a place whose name is forever connected with hardship and death. It would become known as the Battle of Gallipoli. This is the ancient city of Troy. Strategically built on an outcrop of rock, it guards the entrance to the Dardanelles Straits and mainland Turkey. 9 separate cities have been built on this site, the earliest dating from 3,000 years BC. In the 12th century, the epic war between the Trojans and the Greeks was fought across this land, all for the love of the beautiful Helen. According to legend, Ajax and Achilles led the Greek armies against King Priam and the Trojan army of Hector and Paris. After 10 years of siege and bitter fighting, it was the Greeks who broke the stalemate, gaining entry to Troy by hiding inside the fabled wooden horse. This romantic history was soon to have another chapter added as the storm clouds gathered over early 20th century Europe. As tension grew among the major continental powers, the spark that ignited the inferno came on June the 28th, 1914, when the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie were assassinated in the Bosnian city of Sarajevo. Within a few weeks, a newly formed alliance known as the Triple Entente between Britain, France and Russia had ranged itself against Germany and Austria. In the months before the outbreak of the war, the Turkish capital of Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, smouldered with intrigue. All the great powers sent missions here, but the Turks took care not to commit themselves to either side. The ancient Ottoman Empire was suffering from years of poor and oppressive rule. In 1909, the sick man of Europe, as it had become known, underwent a change of leadership with the emergence of the Young Turks, a youthful group of assorted revolutionaries, politicians, and adventurers. They were led by Talat Bey, whose political intrigues ensured that no one knew which side they might join. Next in line, and by far the most dangerous, was Enver Pasha, the Minister for War. He was a powerful figure, almost universally hated by other political groups and by the army. He'd cultivated relations with the Germans after a period as military attaché in Berlin. In 1914, he agreed to the establishment of a German military mission in Turkey. Mustafa Kemal was another of the original Young Turks. Given command of the 19th Division at Gallipoli, he was destined to emerge as one of the most significant figures of the campaign. The Young Turks' first task was to help reorganize the army under the leadership of the German General Liman von Sanders and his team of advisors. He started by strengthening the defenses surrounding the Dardanelles, building up the number of mobile artillery units both on the peninsula and the Asian coast. The infantry were also put through a series of intensive exercises. In 1914, Turkish troops were considered inferior to their European counterparts, but this opinion would soon change as their courage and tenacity in defending their homeland became apparent. The legend marked out on this hillside reminds passing travelers of the sacrifice that was made here by thousands of soldiers who died to give Turkey her freedom. The location of the Dardanelles was vitally important. The channel separates mainland Turkey from the Gallipoli Peninsula and was the main supply route to get weapons into Russia and grain out. On the 4th of August 1914, Britain and France finally declared war on Germany. The previous day, Winston Churchill, as First Lord of the Admiralty, confiscated 2 Turkish battleships being built in British yards. One of them, the Sultan Osman I, was nearing completion at Armstrong's on Tyneside. Her guns had been tested and the Turkish crew were waiting to take possession. This seizure outraged the Turkish people, pushing them closer to an alliance with Germany.
Traditionally, the Turk and the Briton had good relationships which had seen British support for Turkish interests and, of course, British interests in this area. But that balance was being changed despite all the endeavours Britain was making with her own intrigues in Constantinople with diplomatic manoeuvring. But then the final pieces of jigsaw come into place. First, Britain requisitions 2 ships which the Turks had felt quite legitimately they had bought, and bought by the people's endeavour as well as the government's endeavour. Turkish women's wedding rings and hard-earned savings of commercial enterprise of Turks had been invested in these ships, which soon should have been seen in the Golden Horn wearing their new Turkish colours, and instead they were kept by the Royal Navy. However, that serious loss to British prestige and respect for Britain was worsened still further by the fact that the Germans appeared to be giving a replacement almost for those ships with the arrival in Turkish waters of Gerbend, a very modern, very powerful battle cruiser, and her consort, the light cruiser Breslau. And with the arrival of these ships, the Turks had, it seemed, compensation for their losses. All of these factors change what had historically been a good relationship between Turk and Britain into one where the balance has swayed towards the Germans.
Enver Pasha, as Minister for War, had been stalling for time, even hinting at an alliance with Russia. But he now chose instead to welcome the German warships, which were soon seen moored in Constantinople, confirming Turkey's alliance with Germany. The Gerbend and Breslau then steamed into the Black Sea, where they attacked the Russian ports, this while flying the Turkish flag. The Allies issued an ultimatum to the Turks, which was ignored, and on the 31st of October, war was declared. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, the lines of trenches that would become a feature of the European landscape for the next 4 years had become established, stretching some 600 miles from the North Sea to Switzerland. On the Eastern Front, the Russians had suffered huge losses, and fearing their total collapse, the Allies devised a plan to assault and capture the Dardanelles. This was the brainchild of Winston Churchill. Before war broke out, he'd hatched the idea with the Secretary of State for War, Lord Kitchener. Now that the Russians were in desperate need of help, Churchill's plan was resurrected. It called for a fleet of aging British dreadnought battleships to force their way through the Dardanelles. Churchill hoped that the Turkish shore batteries would be quickly overcome. The fleet would then steam on into the Sea of Marmara, through the Bosphorus, and into the Black Sea. The Allies were optimistic that the appearance of a battle fleet in front of Constantinople would cause panic. Turkey's only 2 munitions factories were within easy range, and the threat of a naval bombardment, it was hoped, would cause the Turks to surrender. The British would lead the Allied attack with 12 battleships, reinforced by the Queen Elizabeth, the most modern and powerful ship in the British fleet. The French contributed 6 battleships, while the Russians, lacking any effective navy of their own, were happy to support the plan. The main dissenting voice was the First Sea Lord, Admiral Fisher. He argued that while the dreadnoughts were expendable, their crews were not. They would be needed to fight the Germans in the North Sea. Despite his reservations, the plan went ahead. To prepare for the assault, Royal Navy battleships bombarded the Turkish forts guarding the southern entrance to the Dardanelles in February and March 1915. Following the final bombardment, parties of Marines were landed at the entrance to the Dardanelles, here at the village of Kumkali on the Asiatic side of the straits, and at Sed El Bahr on the European coast at Cape Helles. Severe damage was inflicted on both forts, and many of their guns were destroyed. Some of the Marines even penetrated inland behind the forts at Kumkali. These attacks gave ample warning to the Turks, and they prepared their defences accordingly. At Sed El Bahr, the large guns of the British battlecruisers had caused considerable damage. Lying only a few miles offshore, the Navy poured a torrent of high explosives onto the Turkish defences. Some of the shells penetrated the ammunition stores, causing massive damage. Others hit the shore batteries, knocking out the large guns designed to protect the entrance to the straits. Ironically, the destruction inflicted here was to be greater than at any later stage of the campaign. Allied submarines were also being used to good effect in attacking Turkish shipping in the Dardanelles. The crew of submarine B-11 were particularly successful.
As a fisherman, I knew that despite the strength of the current in midstream, if I crept close into the shore there would be slack water. We dived to 60 feet at the Narrows, waited a while, and then moved up and through. I came up to periscope depth and saw on the starboard quarter a large old Turkish battleship. I fired one torpedo and then had to reduce speed because the lights were getting low and our batteries were failing. By using full revs we got off, but I couldn't see the way out of the bay. I looked for the furthest bit of land through the periscope, but the coxswain said the spirit compass lenses had packed up and all he could see were black spots. I told him to follow them, and at full speed in 20 minutes a sea horizon appeared on our port head. The stunt was very amusing and full of excitement. I hear I sent 100 Turks and many Germans to sleep. I'm afraid it lies very lightly on my chest.
In the event of troops being committed, a commander would be required. Sir Ian Hamilton was called upon as one of Kitchener's most trusted commanders. He had served under Kitchener as an aide in the Sudan, and like most of the general staff, was very much in awe of the great man. He was, after all, K of K, Kitchener of Khartoum. This led to a reluctance on Hamilton's part, as with many of his contemporaries, to question any of Kitchener's directives. Hamilton was a Scot, aged 62 at the time of his appointment. He was a career soldier whom many regarded as the most gifted military commander of the age. He was an intellectual with a passion for writing and poetry. He was good-natured and sensitive. He preferred to suggest courses of action to his subordinates rather than enforce, a strategy that would ultimately prove disastrous. Hamilton's leading generals displayed contrasting styles. Lieutenant General William Birdwood was loved by the Australian and New Zealand troops he came to command. But Sir Aylmer Hunter Weston, in command of the superb 29th Division Regulars, gained a reputation for repeating mistakes and suffering heavy casualties. Hamilton's unwillingness to impose his will on his staff resulted in many missed opportunities, and while he was much admired for his bravery and charm, it was drive and speed of action that were required here. Meanwhile, as the Turks continued to strengthen their defences around the Dardanelles, the battle to take the Straits was about to begin. This is the town of Çanakkale on the Asian side of the Dardanelles. It overlooks the point known as the Narrows. Here, the two coastlines are less than a mile apart. It was from the naval base here that the Turkish Navy sent out its mine layers to block the channel. On the night of the 7th of March, the mine layer Nusret slipped undetected down the Asiatic side of the Dardanelles to lay 20 mines parallel to the coast. This was a change to the normal strategy of laying a series of mines at various points across the straits. The Nusret's mines had been placed in an area where Allied battleships had been seen on manoeuvres the previous day. It was here that the Turkish trap was set. It was to have devastating consequences. North Sea trawlers had been requisitioned and sent to the Dardanelles in an attempt to clear the minefields, but they were slow-moving and made easy targets for the Turkish shore batteries. The civilian crews suffered many casualties. Royal Navy ratings were drafted in to help stiffen the resolve of the trawler crews, but this also failed, leaving many of the mines intact. On the 18th of March, the British and French fleets steamed past here, heading north, its mission to subdue the Turkish defences at the Narrows. As the Allied fleet sailed in formation into the narrow confines of the Dardanelles, they were subjected to intensive shell fire. A vicious firefight began between the ships and the many forts and mobile gun batteries. As the exchange of gunfire grew in intensity, the ships on the right of the fleet were less than a mile from the Asiatic shore. As they neared the coast to end their attack, they turned for home, confident that the route ahead was clear. This played into the hands of the Turks, whose strategy in deploying the Nusret's mines now appeared to be working. As the huge ships swung around, tragedy struck, The French battleship Bouvet, which had been damaged by shell fire and was listing badly, then hit one of the Nusret's mines and sank in only 30 seconds, with a loss of 690 of her crew.
I couldn't rise to the surface because of the tug of the water. I was under for some time. Then when the ship touched the bottom of the sea, I came straight up, either because of the impact or because the boiler exploded. I couldn't breathe. Blood was coming out of my mouth, my ears and my eyes. If I had not found a piece of wood, I should have been a goner. When I was on the surface again, I could see one or two other men who were being machine gunned from the shore and killed.
This was just the beginning of what would be a disastrous day for the Allies. The British battleships Irresistible and Ocean both hit mines and sank. The Inflexible was also hit and badly damaged, but managed to limp away, as sailors manning the pumps in an attempt to keep her afloat. A second French battleship, the Suffren, had sustained several hits and had to be run aground to stop her sinking. The Allies were stung by the ferocity and accuracy of the Turkish fire. The British flagship Queen Elizabeth was ordered to withdraw. The Navy could ill afford to lose its finest and most modern battleship. Such sudden losses and severe damage stunned the Allies, and they abandoned the attack. This jolt to their confidence was to have grave repercussions when they failed to press home the assault the following day. Following this defeat, the Navy was never to enter the Dardanelles in such force again. This was the first and perhaps the most serious blunder of the campaign, if not the entire war. Admiral de Robeck, in command of the fleet, had wanted to call off the attack. But many, like the brilliant Commodore Keyes, felt that the Navy should continue to press for a breakthrough. Fate was destined to play its part in the campaign, as Hamilton, dispatched to the peninsula by fast cruiser, arrived just in time to see the Navy routed. One of the Turkish gunners was destined to become a national hero that day, following his efforts in feeding the big guns. The Navy's failure to follow up the attack of the 18th provided the Turks with a morale-boosting victory, one that seemed destined to mirror so much that was to follow. One of the main objectives of the attack had been the forts at Kilid Bar and Çanakkale on either side of the Narrows. Both had been heavily shelled. The defeat caused consternation in London, but despite this, the War Cabinet supported de Robeck's decision to withdraw. It was clear now that the army would have to be brought in to join the Navy in a combined operation.
The army, though it was dispersed, was there, ready, and its commander-in-chief had viewed these operations, and Ian Hamilton had no doubt in his mind that there needed to be a combined operation. Of course, he must have been aware that the burglar had, as it were, knocked on the door and advertised his presence, and it would take quite some time to get his force ready for such a major operation as a combined operation landing against opposition. Of course, we can see today from our comfortable armchairs that to give the whole operation any chance of success, a combined operation would have had to have been assessed as to whether it was possible, had you got the resources for it, given the need to beat the Germans where they were placing their main forces on the Western Front. Such a measured consideration that was necessary. But war sometimes doesn't allow such a measured consideration as we like to think today.
It was typical of the campaign that little regard had been paid to any forward planning. The assault on Gallipoli had been seen as a naval attack. Now that the army was to be brought in, it was found that little attention had been paid to any previous intelligence about conditions on the peninsula. Reports from officers who had served here were ignored. Now that troops were to be committed, units of the Royal Naval Division and the 29th Division Regulars prepared to leave.
Up to now we did not know our destination, but we thought we were bound for the Dardanelles, as we were part of the 29th Division and had some of the finest British soldiers with us. The officers arranged a boxing competition for the troops. They all fought very well, showing all the best characteristics of the British soldier: manliness, fairness, bulldog tenacity, and gentlemanliness.
These two young stowaways were found, going on to join the two French divisions sent to divert the Turks' attention with the attack at Kumkali on the Asian shore. Australian and New Zealand troops en route to the Western Front were diverted to Egypt, where they encountered British units.
The Arab quarter was out of bounds, but of course we went there. We seemed to get on particularly well with the Anzacs, and they liked the R&D men. A friendship seemed to grow up, and this remained throughout the campaign.
Many thousands of Allied troops were assembled in the Egyptian port of Alexandria. This would become the main base for supplying men and material to Gallipoli, and for bringing casualties out. The destination for these troops was the island of Lemnos, which lay 60 miles southwest of the peninsula. Hundreds of ships of every kind were now headed in its direction.
We continued loading operations during the day and embarked at 4:30 p.m. We lay in the stream until next day. It was a sight of a lifetime to see so many vessels in a port. There must have been over 200, many of them carrying French troops. Every kind of ship is arriving: battleships, battle cruisers, light cruisers, torpedo boats and submarines. A seaplane was launched from the aeroplane ship and circled round the harbour, a great sign of the potency of the appurtenances of our forces.
While the Allies continued their preparations, the Turks under German orders were busy strengthening their defences. Lehmann von Sanders had 80,000 troops under his command, comprising 6 divisions. He sent 2 of them to Kumkali on the Asian shore, where a major Allied landing was expected. The other 4 were stationed on the peninsula. One of them, commanded by Mustafa Kemal, was given the key role of acting as a mobile force. The Allied commanders now decided that the landings would take place on the 25th of April. It would be the largest amphibious assault the world had seen. Nothing like this had been attempted before. Getting such a large force ashore in the face of what was hoped would be only token resistance, Hamilton would attack with a force of almost 75,000 men. At last, the time had come for the troops to leave Lemnos, heading towards the peninsula. Many looked forward to the landing with a sense of foreboding. Others saw it as the experience of a lifetime. Some wondered how they would cope with the coming ordeal.
We are off. In the quiet afterglow, Lemnos lies to the west. Tomorrow we are to land in Gallipoli. I have been looking at my lass's photograph, her eager eyes challenging me to manliness. Is she praying for me tonight?
On the morning of the 25th of April 1915, some 75,000 British and French soldiers were landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula and the Turkish mainland. They were part of the biggest seaborne assault the world had ever seen. Following the disastrous naval battle in the Dardanelles Straits, the decision had been taken to put troops ashore. It was the start of an 8.5 months campaign, one from which many thousands of these soldiers would never return. In the early hours of April the 25th, a fleet of ships laden with 75,000 Allied soldiers approached the Gallipoli Peninsula, heading for 2 main landing points. The Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, or Anzacs as they were known, were to be landed halfway up the peninsula, while the regular army soldiers of the crack 29th Division were to be put ashore at 6 beaches around Cape Helles. The Anzacs went in at first light, but landed further south at the wrong place, not at Gaba Tepe as had been planned, but here at Anzac Cove a mile further north. This was blamed on a combination of strong currents and navigational errors by the Navy. The troops were confronted by a confused landscape of cliffs and razorback ridges. Due to the nature of the terrain, the area was lightly defended. Realizing this, the Anzacs took off in furious pursuit of the Turks, even as more men and equipment were being rushed ashore to consolidate the beachhead. Mustafa Kemal, the Turkish commander, was sent into action in an attempt to stop the Anzacs taking the high ground of the Sarıyer Ridge and Şanlıurfa. This was the key to capturing the peninsula. Dozens of bitter fights broke out, with many men getting lost in the maze of gullies. The Anzacs' over-enthusiasm led to chaos and heavy casualties, but some of them had advanced far enough to gain a glimpse of the distant Dardanelles on the far side of the peninsula. Kemal summoned up every man he could find and threw them into action. Desperate fighting continued throughout the day, resulting in the Anzacs being kept off the Sarıyer Ridge. A great chance had been lost. Further south at Cape Helles, the British troops met with mixed fortunes. At V and W beaches, the Turks had plenty of warning. V Beach was to provide one of the most enduring images of the campaign, as the steamer River Clyde, packed with 2,000 troops, was run aground in the face of the enemy's artillery and concentrated machine gun fire. As the ship ground ashore, hatches cut into her bows were opened and the troops poured out to confront a hail of machine gun fire. It was 6:30 a.m. as the troops dashed down the specially constructed gangways. Hundreds of casualties were sustained as the men were caught in the narrow field of fire. An aircraft flying overhead reported the sea ran red with blood 50 yards out from the shore. This unique photograph was taken from the River Clyde soon after the landing. It shows soldiers in the very thrall of battle. Many lie dead or wounded, unable to move, while units of the Munster, Dublin and Hampshire regiments can be seen taking shelter from the concentrated Turkish machine gun fire. 4 of their number are crawling towards the enemy barbed wire in an attempt to get off the beach. Many more remain trapped on the shoreline. These men would remain pinned down till nightfall when, under cover of darkness, they and the remaining troops on board the River Clyde were able to advance without further loss. W Beach had been heavily fortified. It was ringed with barbed wire and machine guns. The 1st Lancashire Fusiliers came ashore here. As they began to leave the cutters, their ranks were ripped apart by gunfire. Some of the soldiers who'd reached the shore were mystified when their mates remained motionless in the boats. They had been shot where they sat, the pressure of their bodies keeping them upright. Their gallantry in forcing their way ashore earned the regiment 6 VCs before breakfast. The Commander-in-Chief, Sir Ian Hamilton, was so moved by their sacrifice that he named W Beach Lancashire Landing. Only a few hundred yards to the east of V Beach at S Beach, the South Wales borderers had managed to dig themselves in. This would be one of the few successes of the day. Here, the casualties had been few, this thanks to the Navy. For once, its covering fire had been effective in dealing with the defenders. X Beach was no more than a strip of sand faced by rugged cliffs. Here, units of the 2nd Royal Fusiliers engaged the few Turkish defenders, quickly capturing the cliff top. When the Turks counterattacked, the border regiment who had just landed scaled the cliff and, together with the Fusiliers, drove the Turks back 600 yards with a furious bayonet charge. But the opportunity to break out and help the Lancashires, who were taking heavy casualties only a few hundred yards away, was not taken. But it was at Y Beach that some historians consider a real opportunity was missed. A force of 2,000 men were landed at this lightly guarded spot. The top was reached with little difficulty, but incredibly, neither of the commanding officers could agree who was senior and should be in command. The resulting fuss saw troops sitting on the cliff tops while the advantage slipped away. A request for orders from the local commander, Hunter Weston, were ignored as he remained separate from the action on board his command ship.
My own view about Y Beach is that however imaginative it may have been to try to outflank the Turkish defences at the toe of the peninsula from Krithia, if you like, looking southwestwards, that the beach from which such a landing could be made was very small, and with a narrow cliff path up which I really think that despite the lack of opposition, they did well to get 2,000 troops. But can we really expect 2,000 troops to hold or cut off the roads and communication across the toe of the peninsula, which would, I think, there be about 4 or 4.5 to 5 miles? And I think that was perhaps over-optimistic. So perhaps we put too much accent on the failure at Y Beach determining any chance of success at Cape Helles.
The objective of all this effort was to capture the hill of Achibaba and the nearby town of Krithia. From the summit of the hill, the Turks had a clear view of the Allied positions below. As the day progressed, much time had been wasted battering at a barred door. Hunter Weston had become transfixed by the slaughter at V and W beaches and had ignored or missed the opportunities at X and Y beaches. It is said that officers from Y Beach had been able to stroll a mile inland to Krithia itself, at that time undefended. Such lost opportunities were typical of the campaign. The Turks took advantage of the Allies' delay and quickly garrisoned Krithia, turning the place into a fortress. At Cape Helles, 3 days after the landings on the 25th, Hunter Weston undertook the offensive known as the First Battle of Krithia. Concentrated artillery fire heralded the start of a series of major actions intended to take the town and the nearby hill of Achibaba. In the following months, thousands of lives would be lost in futile attempts to capture them. Of the 14,000 troops who attacked on the 28th, 3,000 were killed. At Anzac, the situation remained critical. A maze of trenches were built. At some places they were less than 10 yards away from the enemy. The Australians dug themselves in while fending off repeated Turkish bayonet charges. Following their efforts here and on the Somme, they were given the nickname Diggers. The fighting in these confined spaces was often of the most desperate nature, with more than 7,000 casualties in the first 3 days. These rapidly growing numbers of wounded were in urgent need of evacuation, as an increasing number of barges and craft were used to ferry them to the waiting transports. It was among these gullies that one of the most celebrated characters of Anzac and of the whole Gallipoli campaign was to emerge. John Simpson Kirkpatrick came from a coal mining family in South Shields, County Durham. He joined the Merchant Navy and jumped ship when it reached Australia, changing his name to John Simpson. When war broke out, he enlisted in the Field Ambulance Corps as a stretcher bearer and soon found himself posted to the peninsula as part of the Australian 3rd Division. It was in the confused and dangerous landscape of Anzac that Simpson was to achieve immortality. In an attempt to cope with the ever-increasing flood of wounded, he befriended one of the many donkeys put ashore to haul supplies. He soon became a familiar sight to the troops. As the fighting raged among the chaos of shells and gunfire, life expectancy at Anzac could be very short. Through it all, Simpson could be seen bringing back the badly injured men. He became known to everyone as the man with a donkey. 3 weeks after he landed, Simpson was killed while bringing in yet another wounded man. In his time at Anzac, he had saved the lives of more than 300 soldiers, including Turks. He remains one of Australia's most treasured heroes. Meanwhile, in front of Krithia, a bitter struggle developed as the British tried to wrest control from the Turks. Some initial success was achieved with the troops gaining nearly 600 yards of no man's land. To follow up this advantage, Hamilton suggested a night attack, but Hunter Weston thought otherwise, with the result that the following daylight raids ended in carnage. Despite the losses, he attacked again next day, losing 6,500 troops in the process. Hamilton now changed his mind about the direction of the assault, switching the emphasis from Helles to Anzac. But before he could act, the Turks attacked. The positions at Anzac have become the stuff of legend. Features of the landscape were given names. This sandstone escarpment became one of the most familiar, known to the troops as the Sphinx. The increasingly ragged Australians occupied an area of beachhead less than 3,500 yards long and only 1,200 yards inland. Many of the trenches had been named after soldiers who'd fought there. Places like Russell's Top, Quinn's Post, or Walker's Ridge became associated forever with sudden and violent death. Johnson's Jolly was so called after Brigadier General Johnson, who called for the Turkish trenches near Lone Pine to be shelled, this to jolly up the defenders. The name Anzac was born when the divisional name of Australian and New Zealand Army Corps was shortened in an attempt to speed up the paperwork. Life here, if you could cling on to it, was miserable. The men were often short of water and racked by dysentery that came with the constant clouds of corpse flies. So they seized any opportunity to enjoy a game or a bit of horseplay. Hygiene was essential, and any chance to get a haircut or to delouse their bodies or their clothing was welcomed. On the 19th of May, the Turks assaulted Anzac with 30,000 men. The densely packed horde swept across this open ground to be met with concentrated rifle fire. The diggers fought each other for a place on the fire step. After days of taking it, it was now their turn to dish it out. Soon the narrow area in front of the trenches was choked with more than 10,000 dead and dying Turks. The carnage was to create a further problem. The stench from so many corpses was unbearable, and the threat of disease from the bodies prompted a truce. On the 24th of May, both sides emerged from their trenches into no man's land to bury the dead.
The unwanted quietness of the day was almost uncanny. The Australians and Turks are only 6 yards apart, and at the end of the truce they shook hands and wished each other luck. They then retired to their trenches and tried to blow each other's heads off. War is a curious business.
It was at this time that a grudging respect for the Turks' fighting abilities was acknowledged. Johnny Turk was seen to be a good and dedicated fighter who behaved honourably. As the summer wore on, the costly attacks at Krithia continued. Hunter Weston was determined to maintain the offensive. This culminated in the Third Battle of Krithia, which began on the 4th of June. 30,000 troops were committed, this time with the help of the French. They sent 2 divisions of troops and 6 batteries of their famous 75mm guns. Their accuracy and firepower were renowned, and during the attacks on Krithia, they had a heartening effect on the British troops on their left flank. The French are sometimes referred to as the forgotten army of the Gallipoli campaign. This even though they held and maintained a vital position on the right flank at Helles. These troops showed great valour in holding their ground, suffering many casualties in the process. As stalemate settled over the peninsula, Hamilton now ordered a new battle plan. The objective was to seize the summit of Chunuk Bair above Anzac Cove. A series of diversionary attacks would take place at Suvla Bay, the Neck, Lone Pine, and south of Krithia. The main assault would be launched from the coastal plain north of Anzac and involved climbing up a series of steep gullies to capture Chunuk Bair. This job fell to the 13th Division, made up from soldiers of Kitchen's new army. This force of more than 10,000 men had been brought ashore undetected, under the cover of darkness, a remarkable feat in itself. They would be joined by the New Zealanders and the Gurkhas. The battle plan's success hinged on winkling out the Turks. On the evening of the 6th of August, the troops advanced up the maze of unreconnoitred gullies. They knew Kemal and his men occupied the heights, but had no idea how many Turks there were, or how well dug in.
We moved into the creek, but the Turks must have had wind of our intended attack. Just as we got there, they opened fire. We didn't fire a shot, as we went out without any cartridges in our rifles. We were told to take the place with the bayonet, and by Jove we did, in great style. 2 Turks came around a bush, and I got them both.
2 days later, British and Gurkha troops reached the crest, while on the right the New Zealanders took the summit itself. They held on there for 2 days before the Turks eventually drove them off, Kemal personally leading the attack. Some of the most desperate fighting of the campaign took place here. For the Allies, it ended in failure. At Anzac, the diversions began, watched by Kemal from a nearby ridge. The attack here at Lone Pine began at 4 p.m. on the 6th of August. The Turks were well dug in, their trenches covered with heavy pine logs. At 5:30 p.m., 3 Australian battalions surged forward in 4 lines. It would be 2 days before the Australians finally took the place.
The tension as we waited for the whistle was unbearable. We had some 70 or 80 yards to go, and as the fire grew hotter, we might have been doubling over crisp straw, as this was the impression the noise of the firing made on me. We had to go straight to the third line trench over the top of the others. I got to this trench absolutely exhausted and was regaining my breath when a big Turk came charging along, pursued by 2 Australians. As he passed me, I shot him in the back.
At dawn the next day, the 8th and 10th Australian Light Horse assaulted the Turkish lines at the neck. The Turkish lines were only 60 yards away. Most of the first wave was annihilated within the first 5 yards. 2 more attacks suffered the same fate.
Well, the right of the line did go over the top, and my brother was killed. We were not ordered out of our trenches, as orders to cancel the 4th line attack in view of the massacre reached us just in time. I was soon told that my brother had been brought in dying. I didn't get to him in time, and all that was left for me to do was to bury him and write to his wife.
Further north at Suvla Bay, the diversion here had the potential to be decisive in its own right. The plan was to get the troops ashore and moving inland as quickly as possible. More of Kitchener's new army were now committed. The 10th and 11th Divisions were landed in purpose-built craft known as Beetles on the night of the 6th of August and the following morning.
Getting ashore was not too bad. We lined up on the beach and got our orders. No firing, bayonet only. I saw Captain Morgan look at his wrist compass and point in the direction of Lala Baba. As we went towards the hill, firing broke out and I heard Turks screaming, "Allah! Allah!" A lot of our men were killed, including Captain Morgan. The wounded were crying out, and in the darkness it was all confusion.
The commander of the Suvla attack, General Stopford, was largely responsible for the confusion, failing to move his men quickly off the beaches. This gave the Turks time to bring in reinforcements. The result was heavy Allied casualties, for no ground gained. 2 weeks after the landing on the 23rd of August, as the troops advanced across the Suvla plain, the battlefield caught fire. Many of the wounded crawled under the scrub in search of shelter, only to be burned to death. If a true hero was to emerge from the confusion of the Gallipoli campaign, it was Kemal. His ruthless determination and his bravery on so many occasions was a major factor in the Turkish victory. It made him a national figure, going on to become the founding father of the Turkish nation. While Kemal stamped his authority on events, Sir Ian Hamilton often only reacted to them as they occurred. As the Allied situation on the peninsula deteriorated, so did his standing in London. The writing was on the wall, and on October the 16th, he was recalled. He had lost the confidence of his generals and the war cabinet and had been further undermined by newspaper criticism at home. It proved to be the last straw. Following this, Kitchener himself visited Gallipoli. What he saw led him to recommend evacuation, even against the advice of some of the generals on the spot. He was convinced the position was hopeless and the troops utterly worn out. In December, the war cabinet agreed. In a final twist of the campaign, the baking heat of the Turkish summer now gave way to storms, floods, and in November, blizzards. There were 16,000 cases of frostbite and 300 men died from the cold. As the order was given to evacuate many from W and V beaches, the rear guards left Suvla on the 20th of December 1915 and from Helles on the 7th of January 1916. More than 100,000 men and their equipment were to be taken off in stages, leaving only small detachments manning the front line, all the support troops having left. Many ruses were set up to mislead the enemy, periods of silence, guns fired by delayed action, and some unlikely new recruits. The Turks were completely fooled. Not a man was lost due to excellent planning, the skill of the navy, and the self-discipline of the men. As the departing ships watched the fires ashore, the final irony of the campaign was that the evacuation was the most successful part of it. The fighting on Gallipoli cost more than 58,000 Allied lives. The Turks lost at least as many, the exact number is still unknown. The British sustained the greatest losses with over 21,000 dead, the French with 13,000, the Anzacs with 9,500, the Indians more than 7,000. There were many others among the Gurkhas, Canadians, and even the Jewish Zion Mule Corps. Those suffering from wounds and disease numbered more than 200,000. With ominous foresight, the poet Rupert Brooke of the Royal Naval Division composed one of the most memorable of all war poems. He died of blood poisoning on the eve of the April the 25th landings. His words would set the tone for the bloodletting of the next 3 years.
If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. There shall be in that rich earth a richer dust concealed, a dust whom England bore, shaped, made aware, gave once her flowers to love, her ways to roam, a body of England's, breathing English air, washed by the rivers, blessed by the sons of home.